we've looked at supply and demand, so now we're going to look at expenses. All right, so there's two types, there's fixed and variable. And in a second I'm going to go through this list here and we'll look at what's fixed and what's variable. But the idea is that fixed costs are things that you have to pay no matter what. So some examples are things like a light bill, taxes, and rent. So if you have a business, let's say you got a store somewhere, these are things you're going to have to pay no matter what happens. And it's kind of a big deal in the pandemic is when stores closed, you're not making any money, but these things are still coming due, and you've got to pay them. And that's a big issue. All right, so that's something to consider with any stores. What are my fixed costs? What do I have to pay no matter what happens? The variable costs have to do with the part where you make money. So usually if you're producing a good or some kind of service, it's everything that goes into producing that. These are things that you tend to, like supplies that you would go through and have to buy more of. And they're variable because the more goods you produce or the more services you do, the more of these expendable things you're going to have to buy. So the better business is, the more of these expenses will change, will probably go up. So things like having to buy gas. If you're going to drive somewhere, the more you drive, the more gas you're going to have to buy. And I put paint because the example we're going to see here in a second, you had to buy paint to make something. Well, the more stuff you paint, the more paint you have to buy. So in a way, the more of that you're buying, the more you're selling, that's a good thing. Materials, any kind of materials that go into producing something. So anything that you have to buy more of to be able to sell, that's a variable cost. Again, fixed are all the things that you're paying no matter what. Variable, they go into the item you're making. So let's run through this list together. It's on the first page of this example. And again, there's a lot of things to read through here. There's a lot of vocab words to make sure you're familiar with. I'm not going to read them for you. You can do that on your own. Save some time in the video. But all right, let's think about some things here. Factory space. All right. So basically, how big of an area do I need to buy? That's probably going to be in the store, buying the store, or renting a place. But that's going to be a factor in how big of an area do I have to have, which increases the rent or mortgage payment. So that's going to end up, in my opinion, that would be a fixed cost, at least for the short term. I mean, you might look at it, my business expands, I might have to buy more floor space, yeah. But basically in a month's time, look at a month's time. That's probably something you would do years down the road, not next month. So in a month's time, the available space you have is not going to change. Furniture. That's probably something you're going to buy one time. And again, you might expand in the future, but for 1 month, that's not probably going to change. So those two are fixed. Delivery trucks. All right. Well, I mean, that one can be kind of tricky too, but if we're buying a truck to deliver stuff with, that's probably, in a short term, a fixed cost. Because I'm buying that truck, and I'm probably not going to buy another one unless years down the road I end up needing it. So that's a payment that I'm going to have on an ongoing basis, no matter what happens. Now, once I've bought that truck, I got to make that payment, whether I sell something or not. But how many goods I sell won't affect that truck payment. So that's a good way to think about it too. If it's something you have a payment that comes due every month, but doesn't affect how many items you sell, then that's a fixed cost. So far, all three of these are fixed costs. And I would say electricity, for the most part, is a fixed cost as well. Unless you have a business that requires a lot of electricity to produce whatever you're making, then it's probably just going to be a fixed cost you're going to pay month to month. It's probably not going to change a whole lot. So those four I would say are fixed. Telephone, computer, office supplies. Well, let's say telephone and computer I would say are fixed, because having a phone for the business, having a computer for the business, you buy them, and you're not going to you're not going to break the computer or the phone to do more business. So you're going to continue, you're just going to keep using those same things over and over. Office supplies, that's probably going to be variable, because the more goods I'm making, the more paperwork I'm having to do from selling those, the more office supplies I'm going to go through. So I would say that's probably variable. These people are painting jeans, by the way, so the number of jeans, that's definitely a variable cost. That's kind of the definition of a variable cost, because the more jeans I paint, and the more I sell, the more I need to buy to replenish my stock. So that's definitely a variable cost for the jeans and the paint also. The more jeans we paint, the more paint we're going to go through, the more paint we're going to have to buy. So those things are completely dependent on how many painted jeans I sell. So those are definitely variable costs. Packaging, I would say that's variable because the more jeans you sell, the more packaging you need to put those in. You're not going to buy packaging unless you're mailing your jeans. So that would completely depend on how much you're selling. That's a variable cost. Postage, just like packaging, variable cost. The more you sell, the more postage you need. Labor, that one can kind of go either way. In the short term, you may not be hiring that many people. So again, think a month's time. I'm probably going to have people not necessarily on a salary, but pretty much the same hours for the most part. And again, this could go either way because maybe you get a friend to come in and help a few hours a week if you need it. And maybe if you don't need it, you don't pay them or you don't ask them to come in. So that could be completely dependent on how many jeans you're going through. Some of these can go both ways. But the ones that are pretty clearly fixed cost are things like rent, taxes, electricity, insurance. Anything you're going to make a monthly payment on and that monthly payment doesn't change, that's a fixed cost. As you go down the page, you're going to see a couple of formulas here. And everything's explained. Expense is basically the variable plus the fixed cost. That's your total expense. And revenue is price times quantity. So whatever I sell something for, let's go back to these jeans. Let's say I sell them for $20 a pair. Well, if I sell 10 jeans, 20 times 10, that's the amount of money I make. If I sell 100, 20 times 100 is how much money I make. So the price I'm selling it for times how many jeans I sell, price times quantity, that's revenue. Revenue is how much money you bring in. It's not profit. It's just how much money you bring in. When you look at your revenue and your expense together, that's how you figure out profit. I'm going to hit the highlights of example 1. You can read it on your own. I would read it first before you watch me talk about it. It says the fixed expenses are $17,600 and one pair of jeans, the cost for these students to make them, $7.53. And when you get to your project, you're going to have to figure out all the expenses that go into something and then figure out how much on average it costs you to make one item. But they've already done all this for us, and it costs these students $7.53 by the time they buy all their materials to make one pair of jeans. So to get our variable cost, that's $7.53 times Q, because it's $7.53 for each pair of jeans, times how many pairs of jeans that I end up making. So the amount times the quantity. It sort of works out like revenue, but that's your variable cost. The fixed expenses or fixed costs, that's not going to change because that's what you got to pay every month. I got a pretty hefty bill here. Must have a pretty big space they're working in. Put it together, and that's your expense equation. 753Q plus 17,600. This won't change. I'm going to pay this amount no matter what. And the more jeans I make, the more my expenses go up because I've got to buy the materials to do that. So think about y-intercept and slope. That's exactly what we're going to see here in a minute when we graph this. Okay, I mentioned average cost a second ago. So that's what this example talks about, is average cost. They give us the expense equation, 118Q plus 12,000. What that means, they're making hand warmers here. So they've got $12,000 set fixed cost, no matter what happens. Even if this business can't even open, they're paying that per month. It costs them $1.18 per hand warmer to make. They're probably going to sell it for more than that, but that's what it costs them to make it. Okay? It says find the total cost of producing 50,000 hand warmers. Well, that's going to be my quantity. And it says right here, sub 50,000 in for Q. That's the number of items I'm making, so that's Q. So that would go in for Q in the equation. And here you can see they did a little substitution, and then they just worked it out. Came out to be $71,000. So if I'm going to make 50,000 hand warmers, because of how much each one costs to make, and my fixed cost, all that together, $71,000. Now they're asking to do the average on this. Average is always the total divided by how many you produced. If you think about your grades, it's the total, you add up all your grades, divided by how many grades you had. So total cost divided by how many items I made here, and that gives me $1.42 for my average cost. Okay? Just to clarify, This was the average cost of materials. This is the average cost total, all right? Factoring in all of my expenses, this is my average cost to make one pair of gloves. And you can kind of probably see why it's hard for a small scale business to compete now, because 50,000 is quite a few. If I'm doing this from my house and I'm able to make 100 a month, well, one thing, I probably don't have these big fixed expenses, but at the same time, my average cost is probably going to be higher because I'm not able to make as many as a big factory can. They can crank out so many that their average cost is really low, which means they can sell it for a lower price than I can. That's why it's really tough for a small business to get started. That's why they have a lot of extra challenges. 3, you can kind of skip for now. This is going to be super important really soon, but I don't think there's going to be any of these on your homework, so you're kind of jumping the gun from what I can tell. You can skip that one, but number 4 is really important. We need to make sure we understand these graphs. They're going to look a lot different than supply and demand because of what we're looking at. So we're going to graph our expense equation, and then we're also going to graph our revenue equation. Now it tells us an expense equation for this widget, whatever that is. $4,200 fixed, $1.10 for each widget they make. Widget's usually an econ name for an item that's being produced. And they're going to sell these things for $2.50 each. Okay, so it costs them $1.10 to make. They're selling it for $2.50. But they also have to make up that fixed cost too, so that factors in. So what we're going to do is we're going to graph the expense equation and the revenue equation together and see what it tells us. We're going to talk about what the axes are, and it has a little bit different than supply and demand. I'm going to do this in Desmos. You can certainly do it on the graphing calculator just fine. I think Desmos is a little bit quicker and easier to read, plus it's in color, and it's just, to me, it's a little bit nicer to deal with. So I'm going to go take a break, and when I come back, I'll be doing it in Desmos. So we've got these 2 equations. We've got an expense equation, and knowing they're going to charge $2.50 each, that's all you need to get a revenue equation, because revenue is price times quantity. So $2.50 is the price. The revenue equation is $2.50 times Q. Before we start graphing, look at where the Q is. Okay, that looks a lot like the X with the slope beside it. So Q is going to be the X-axis. Okay, there it is right there. This is Q. Y-axis is kind of confusing here because it depends on which graph we're talking about. And you notice they don't really have it labeled. They just say dollars. If we're talking about an expense equation, then the y-axis is expense. If we're talking about the revenue equation, the y-axis is our revenue. But dollars is probably a really good way to express that. It's not the same as price from demand, but the quantity is the same as the demand. So you'll see soon that you take your supply and demand curves and you actually plug them into these steps. And that's how you get to kind of another level. So there's kind of 3 main types of graphs we're going to look at. You got supply and demand, and then you got revenue and expense in terms of quantity. That's because there's a Q right here. You got to look really carefully with the variables right here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do it in Y and X because that's how you typically graph something. So first up, the expense, 110Q, but I'm going to put 110X and 4,200. All right, let's get this where it shows up. X-axis might be kind of tricky at first here if you don't know how many you're going to produce because it's quantity. Now we saw in the other example, we got up to the tens of thousands, so it's probably going to be a lot. We could maybe start zooming out a little bit, but what I would start with for sure is the y-intercept. You're going to have 4,200 of your expense is 4,200 minimum. That's your fixed cost. It's only going to go up from there. So I would start with 0 for the y, and I would probably double that or come close to it and go up to 8,000. All right. And it looks like that might have been doing too much at first, but let's for X, let's put maybe 0 to start for the left side. Maybe do 10,000 for the upper end, just see kind of where that plays out. I would really tell you to use those windows. I would not try zooming out at this point because it may work, but a lot of times the difference in price and quantity just makes it
or the dollar amount and the quantity, just you don't get a good graph when you try to just zoom out. So I think the window settings is probably the best place to start. And you can always change those once you set them. They're not set forever, and you can still zoom in and out from here. Once you can see your line, you're in good shape. So I would definitely use that y-intercept to get started, and then you can kind of play around from there. Now the revenue equation, it was 250Q. Now I used X instead of Q for both of these. So I'm just gonna say Y equals 250X, okay? So there's our revenue equation. Now I'm gonna do them one at a time here, just kind of talk about what's going on. So this widget, if I make, because x-axis is quantity, y-axis is dollars. If I don't make any of these items, it's cost me $4,200 because that's my fixed cost. I'm paying that no matter what. The more of these items I make, the more my cost goes up. Make sure that makes sense. The more items you make, the more your cost goes up because you have to buy the materials. All right, let's just look at revenue now. If I don't sell anything, my revenue is zero. And that should make sense too. If I don't sell anything, how do I make any money? You only make money when you sell something. Now, as I start to sell these items, my revenue goes up. The more items I sell, the more money I make. It's $2.50 times however many I sell. All right, so take a minute, make sure that makes sense. And then we're going to put them together. Now, it's kind of like an equilibrium point happening here, but it's a little bit different. It's quantity and dollars. So I'm going to need to make at least 3,000 of these widgets. And it's going to cost me $7,500 to make that happen. But if I sell them all, I'm also going to make $7,500 back. So that's what we call the break-even point. Okay, and you're going to see that explained down here. This intersection right here, it's called a break-even point. Now, the next page, you see this red and green graph. Think about what happens down here. Let's say I only make 2,000 of these things. Well, if I do that, my revenue is $5,000, but it's costing me $6,400. That means it cost me another $1,400 than what I made. That's not good. That puts me at a loss. So if that's all I'm able to sell, I got a problem. If that's all I can make, I got a problem. I'm not making any money here. I'm losing money. So anything in this red area, you're operating on a loss because your expenses are higher than your revenue. Revenue is this line, expense is this line. Okay? Follow them out. Once you get to this point, you're breaking even. Now, you don't want to operate there either, right? If you're just breaking even, that might be nice for a charity, but you're not making any profits. You can't pay employees and you're not making any money. Let's see what happens if I sell more than 3,000. Let's say I sell 4,000. We'll zoom out a little bit. All right, well, now my expenses are $8,600, but my revenue is $10,000. So now I'm making $1,400. That's a profit. That's a good thing. That's what I want to do. That's what a business is designed to do, is make a profit. So that's this green area. Anywhere in this green area, your revenue is higher than your expense. So that's what all this stuff's about on this page. But again, make sure that you can graph revenue and expense and be able to find that break-even point. You're going to have a lot of questions about that as we move forward.